All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Friday, August 13th, 2021. A little Friday the 13th action here going on for us today. So hopefully that doesn't mean bad luck for us in our DFS contest, but we'll see how it goes. Thank you, everybody that's tuning in here. We've got a couple people that have just trickled in live. I know there's plenty more that will be watching this here as a recording, so thank you all that are giving me some of your attention here today. If this is your first time watching the stream, I know we get a ton of new viewers here watching every single day. Thanks for tuning in. This is a live Q&A style stream where I answer questions from SaberSim users about SaberSim, about how to get the most out of our tools. I answer, some kind of instructional product demo type questions. We talk a little bit of strategy, whatever you guys want to talk about. So we get questions in through support, our email inbox, support@sabersim.com. If you ever have questions, feel free to shoot me an email. We get questions in through our Office Hours channel on Slack. If you're not already in Slack, highly recommend it. There is a link to join our Slack channel in the description of every past Office Hours video. And I get questions, of course, through YouTube chat. So not monitoring email so much live on the stream, but I keep a very close eye on the YouTube chat and the Office Hours channel in Slack throughout the stream. And we do this live for a reason. So if I'm answering a question or we're talking about a certain topic or anything like that, and you're a little confused, a little lost, or have something that you want to add to the conversation, please do. Those are the best streams when we have a lot of engagement from you guys. So always feel free to throw your questions and comments into the live channels here while we are live. Let's see. I've got a few questions that have really trickled in, particularly in the last half hour here. So it should be a decent stream. But of course, if you've got something you want to ask, pop it into the chat now. I go through these questions generally in chronological order. So go ahead and throw those in. But we will go ahead and get into it here pretty quickly. It's been a good week so far. I guess the last note, I don't know if anybody is keeping up to date with the greatest hits playlist on YouTube. Those are segments from Office Hours streams that I've snipped out, segments that either I liked quite a bit, enjoyed talking about, or we've gotten a lot of follow-up questions or anything like that, or anything like that twice. So I'm going to be, I guess, long story short, I'm going to be updating that playlist here, hopefully today or Monday, with some new content that's come out in the past couple weeks of Office Hours here. We've had some really good segments in this week in particular. So I want to get that updated for you guys. But I will go ahead and just get us started here. We've got, again, a few questions here, so we'll just go ahead and jump in. But I want to get this started with a question that came in through support. This was from Robert. Sounds like Robert's maybe just kind of having a hard time figuring out exactly where to get started. I know that the app can be pretty intimidating at first glance here, especially for new users. There's just a lot of information happening on screen. So definitely a good question. Want to spend some time talking about this. So especially if you're new, just getting familiar with the tools, there's a lot of opportunities to add value in the tool. There's a lot of places to kind of leave your mark. But I think for newer players, there's definitely a particular path that I would recommend. So first of all, when you're looking at this home screen and you're seeing all the team totals and the player projections, it's important to note that we have got a rigorous baseball model behind this that's simulating each game play by play thousands of times to determine these projections. So I would say overall, especially if you're trying to figure out just where to start as a beginner, I would recommend kind of rolling with the default projections. I think there's a lot of value that can be added by making adjustments. I think you can also introduce some leverage and some strategy into your projection adjustments overall. But just getting familiar, I think it's a good place, at least running your test builds, to leave some of this alone. I would also say the same thing for our sliders and your build settings. The whole point of our build settings is we can leverage the simulation game data that we have to build correlation into our lineups without having to set stack rules, to properly fade ownership to get the right amount of leverage for a contest, and to take advantage of our game simulations in the form of smart diversity to create upside and diversity in our lineup. So when you go in and set, say you're playing a 20 max, something like this, maybe this contest, this would be something like the quarter jukebox. These sliders are actually set in a data-driven back-tested approach where we run thousands of lineups at every single slider setting and then determine what has the highest expected value across a variety of different slates. So these are not just where we think they should be or our best guess. They're actually historically data proven slider settings. So I would also recommend using the default sliders as you're still getting familiar. And then from there, running what we call a test build here, or maybe this is actually your build, and doing a lot of your work here in step 3. And what's nice about working here in step 3 and adding a lot of your value in step 3 is that instead of just building 20 lineups, we're going to build a large pool of probably 500 lineups. And it's going to establish a foundation. I like to think about it as a playground of lineups that we think are viable for the contest based on what our projections say and what contests that you said you're playing, right? It's going to give you 500 different lineups to kind of work with. And you'll see that you've actually got a lot of different opportunities to leave your mark here while knowing that you're playing with a set of 500 lineups that we think is overall viable for the contest. So this is where I think you can kind of work and add some of your overall value of your own research to the process while still kind of knowing that you're playing within the bounds of what the overall projections and the slider settings say for the slate. So say, for example, I think one common thing that I see a lot of users do here is maybe be a little bit cautious of playing too much exposure to one hitter, right? Hitters are very variant. They have pretty spectacular downside. Their most average outcome is often 0 to 5 points. So you could go in and handle this from the approach of lowering your risk to certain hitters by lowering their max exposure here. And what we're doing is we're filtering through the lineups in our pool of 500 to find the best 20 that fit our exposure settings. So we could go ahead and do something like this. So we've got everyone down to say 30 or so. We can also take our stands. We can make our more leverage-based strategy decisions here in step 3 by doing things like maybe we think Milwaukee, well, first of all, I think Milwaukee's got a weather game concern. So maybe we eliminate Milwaukee from our stacks here. We don't want to even worry about the weather. We could say, I don't know exactly what the field is likely to do tonight yet. I haven't really studied the ownership, but say maybe Cleveland is going to be a pretty chalky team, and we want to be cautious with our exposure to the chalk. Again, I don't know that they're chalky, but just as an example. And maybe we want to also play a really tight pool of pitchers, right? There's maybe 4 pitchers at the top that we really want to get a lot of exposure to. And we can go ahead and maybe trim down to a nice pool of, say, well, it looks like it kind of wants us to play. Let's just get down to 4. Yeah, so we've got a nice pool of 4 pitchers, all really nicely, highly projected aces, things like that. So again, what's really nice about this is we've taken quite a bit of complexity and a lot of options in terms of editing projections and editing slider settings and editing exposures and trimmed this down. And we've got a pool of lineups that I think are very well optimized for upside and will have win equity in a contest of this type without having to have done anything too dramatic or getting kind of overwhelmed with all the opportunities that we have here. So that's what I would recommend for a beginner player to SaberSim. Again, this isn't necessarily a beginner to DFS, right? You can get a ton of value in your exposures. You can really dial this in. In fact, most of my process generally revolves around mostly editing exposures here anyway, rather than editing projections and build settings and things like that. So as a beginner to SaberSim, that's what I highly recommend. That's kind of the approach. As you get familiar, you get an idea of what your plan is going to be and how you're going to attack your exposures in step 3. I think at that point, you can start to work in some gentle projection editing once you really feel confident about that step 3 part of the approach. I would say if you want to start exploring editing projections, I would do so on the team level. What I mean by that is rather than adjusting player projections directly, adjust the team projections. So we had mentioned before that we were going to maybe fade Cleveland. Another way to do that would be instead to drop their team projection. Maybe they're even with Detroit instead of 0.4 runs over. And when you click yes, what we're actually going to do is we're going to dynamically update the player projections for the players playing in this game accordingly. So you can see the hitters go down, probably the Detroit pitcher goes up a bit, right? It makes it a little bit easier to manage projections this way because you know that all the individual player projections are going to get tweaked the right way based on the way you think the game is going to play out. So I think that's something you can go ahead and work in once you're familiar with the tool a little bit more and how you want to go about editing your exposures. But as you're getting started, I really like that approach overall. build your pool of lineups, use the default projections, use the default build settings, and add your value in step 3, right? You know that you're working within the bounds of what the builder kind of wants to give you, 500 viable lineups that you're basically pulling your 20 out of, and you can adjust exposures up and down as you see fit from there. So, but Robert, as always, if you have more follow-up questions for me, or if there's something you're still confused by, feel free to just reach back out via email is fine. And let me know if there's anything else I can help answer for you. So, but great question. And again, I know at first glance, it seems like there's a lot going on, but we've really tried to make this as simple as possible when you kind of break everything down into its individual steps. So, I see a few people are trickling in here. Andrew said, got that Friday feeling. And Jim said the Friday the 13th. Yeah. I'm not a super superstitious type. Super superstitious. It's kind of sounds funny. Myself, Andrew said he's not superstitious either. But yeah, we'll see how everything works out. James said, morning, my friend. What's up, man? How's it going? Cool. So I will go ahead and keep us rolling here. See a couple questions trickling in YouTube chat as well. That's awesome. I'm going to roll through the questions we got in Slack ahead of the show, handle all this chronologically. So let's go ahead and jump over to Adam's question about ownership. And he said, you've had this question before, so sorry for redundancy. That's no problem. Always happy to return to certain topics or questions. How is the model affected when you bump ownership for some players and not others, given that there's a certain amount of total ownership that all players on the slate can add up to? Thanks. Yeah, so really good question. We have gotten this one before, but it's important to review. So we talk a lot about the value that you can add to your process by editing ownership projections, by looking at Vegas or around the industry and see who's kind of getting touted. And there is this idea that, you know, the way we create our ownership projections and the way any good ownership model would work is that the projections are going to add up to the correct value, right? Pitchers, for example, all of the pitchers, if you sum this up, need to add up to 200%. That's because there are 2 pitchers, right? And there's 100% total ownership at a position, so 200%, right? So what happens if I'm tweaking ownership projections and I think Morton's actually going to be a little bit more owned, and Flaherty, I never know how to pronounce his name, is going to be a little bit more owned, and actually Robbie Ray is going to be a little bit more owned, right? And this is actually kind of what we see a lot on these slates, where the highest projected pitchers end up actually being a fair bit more chalky even than maybe we sometimes project. And now we've got this problem because we know that the projections, the ownership projections, are not going to add up to 200%. I would say in general, this isn't something you need to worry about very much. And the reason why is because when we determine whether or not we're going to fade ownership on a certain player, we're comparing that player's ownership to the average ownership at the position, right? So the average ownership at the position is actually typically just going to always be the total ownership at the position divided by the number of players in the pool. So say, for example, we have roughly 28 pitchers, right? There's 14 games, a pitcher for each game. Our average ownership in this case at the start would probably be 200 divided by 28. So that's a little over 7%. So anybody that is over 7% owned is going to have a little bit of a negative multiplier on their projection, which is the way that the ownership fade works, depending on how high your ownership fade is set. Anyone below about 7.14 projected ownership is going to have a positive multiplier that boosts them, that emphasizes them in your builds. But when we update the ownership projections, we are also updating the average. We're also increasing the average. So I don't know if necessarily mathematically it divides out perfectly, but in the interest of time, I think it's not something that anyone needs to worry about in their process. I don't worry about it in my process because even though these individual player ownership projections are going up, so is the average of the position. So it essentially kind of balances out. That makes it kind of a convenient way that we're handling ownership, makes it very easy to deal with there. It also, at least the way I think about it, and I think as far as I know, most people kind of think about this, I think our ownership tends to maybe, especially on the highest owned plays veer a little bit lower, a little bit under rather than over. So I think most of the time the ownership adjustments I'm making are bumping up the plays that I expect to be the highest owned. And it's just not always very easy or intuitive to go and then find the guys that ownership is going to come from. I'm not super concerned about ownership at the low end, right? You're more concerned about ownership at the high end, because that's where you get your greatest leverage on the field. And we'll talk about that in the next question, actually. That's how I would answer that question. Again, since we Since all ownership is compared to the average of the position, and that average of the position updates when you update your ownership projections, this isn't something I think you need to worry about too much. But Adam, don't know if you're here watching along with me today. Let me know if that is helpful. If you catch this later as a recording, always feel free to chime back in with any follow-up questions you've got for me. So, but really good question. Give me 1 second. I'm going to drink a little water. My mouth is going dry. All right, I get talking, I get going on my DFS rants here, and sometimes my mouth dries up on me. Good to stay hydrated. But another question here from Devin. This is a great question. I was really excited to see this one come in. And he said, when running a research build and looking at the own percent and the optimal percent, what do you consider to be statistically significant enough for you to consider being overweight, underweight, or total fading? Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, first of all, this method, I think, benefits the most once you've made some adjustments to ownership projections. So I'm actually going to kind of do that a little bit here. I want to look at Vegas real quick and get an idea of who the chalky teams are, and I want to boost some ownership projections. Okay, so it looks like I think Red Sox will probably be pretty highly owned. So I want to make sure that I have some like good higher owned plays in here. And again, this is just estimating. I'm just doing this for the sake of example, but I want to make sure that I have the right teams in here. And Milwaukee, I know there's weather concerns in that game, but I want to. And what I do when I'm doing this really quick and dirty, and this is actually true of what my process looks like, is I'll take like the top 4 or 5 guys and bump up. I'll just like double their projection if I think that's where the chalk is going to go. I find this to be just very quick and just get an idea. But so what Devin's referring to here is a research build, which if you are unfamiliar, haven't seen this before, research build is where we take advantage of our game simulations and smart diversity to get an idea of what we think is going to be optimal, what optimal looking lineups might be if we simulated the slate basically 1,500 times. And when smart diversity is at 10, we use single game simulations to determine the projections for each player as we build each lineup. And in effect, when we run this build, we get an opportunity to see, after 1,500 builds, basically 1,500 different sets of random game simulations, what optimal lineups might look like. So the question here is, when I'm thinking about this, what do I want? Let me think, like, where do I find leverage? How much discrepancy does there need to be in projected ownership and exposure for this to be effective? And the answer is kind of difficult. It's not always very easy. I think the best way to think about it is almost to reverse that and look at your exposures as the chance of the player being optimal, and then ask yourself, based on what you have with ownership projections, but also your own intuition, do you think those players are going to come in lower or higher owned than that? And where do you want your leverage to be from there? So let's go ahead and let this run real quick, because I think it's important for this point. I saw this question come in from Cody, so I want to answer this. So Cody said, I wanted a little bit more information on smart diversity. How many different sims of the game does it run? So we simulate each game thousands of times. I don't know what the exact number is. I think it's probably around 5,000 game simulations of each game. I think that might be a little bit more or a little bit less depending on the slate, right? So we simulate each game that many times. And when you're using smart diversity, right, the higher your smart diversity slider is, the smaller the bucket of random game simulations we're going to pull out to determine each player's projection for every single lineup we build. So at 0, it's easiest thought about at the extremes. At 0, we're going to use every game simulation we have and basically just use our average projections to build lineups. At 10, we're going to use single game simulations, one single game, and use those players' projections that they scored in the one random game simulation we pull out to determine the players' projections when we build lineups, right? So this is very much going to emphasize upside and diversity, right? Because there's a lot of diversity when you take random game sims from 14 baseball games. Somewhere in the middle or the higher end or like this are going to create various different sized buckets to determine how many random game simulations we're taking in. So roughly thinking about this as a spectrum, on the one side on the left, we will have lineups that are more optimized for average performance and a less diverse player pool. And up at the high end here, we will have lineups that are more optimized for upside and a more diverse player pool. And when we set it at 10 and run this build with ownership fade off, we're using SaberSim here more as a research tool, because when we expand our pool to 1,500, what our exposures become in this case is it essentially becomes a way of quantifying a player's chance to be optimal after 1,500 different simulations of the entire slate come out, right? 1,500 different unique game outcomes. So very good question. Hopefully that helps. I'm going to kind of jump back to this question here and talk about this. So again, I think this is where it gets kind of tricky, and you'll see for players that we don't change their ownership projection, these things can get really close, right? These numbers can sometimes kind of approach each other. There's not always a clear way to get leverage. And that's why I think it's important to apply a little bit of your own ownership knowledge and intuition here. This method flies a little bit too close to the sun with how our ownership projections are generated to sometimes get something meaningful out of this. So I think the most important thing is ask yourself, like, do you think these players are going to be owned, especially using your intuition and what you're seeing in Vegas, higher than their chances of being optimal? One of those, let's start with pitcher. I think one of those that is really interesting would be a guy like Charlie Morton. I know I kind of arbitrarily bumped up his projected ownership here to 35 for the example of the previous question. But I do think he's likely to be one of the chalkier pitchers on the slate. I think he's very affordable for his price. Where is the Washington game? Am I missing it? I don't see it. Maybe not so much. Where's Washington? Am I crazy? Oh, yeah, they're right here. Okay, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, one of the lower projected teams on the slate, a team that Vegas is trending downward. I think Charlie Morton is likely to be pretty popular. And there's also some uncertainty with this, right? So essentially, I think what this is saying is that if our expectation for Charlie Morton is that he is optimal 20% of the time, if he is going to be owned more than 20% of the time, he is inefficient to be over the field on. But then there's the question of how confident are we in that, and how much is he going to be over-owned by 20%? If he's 35% or 40% owned, when I think a player is going to be 2 times as owned as their chance of being optimal, that's when I start considering maybe a full fade is in order. It's around that line where I think the field is going to be 2x inefficient on that player. That's when I start thinking about a full fade. If the player is, I think, going to be over-owned, for example, but maybe not that aggressively over-owned, I might cap ownership. I might cap ownership or cap exposure, in my post-build process to what I expect the field to be on that player. So if I thought maybe the field was going to be 20 to 25% ownership on Morton, I might be capping him at like 20% of my lineups, trying to make sure that I'm not over leveraged on a player that I think the field is already overestimating their outcomes, right? I think this is also best done at the extremes. The reason why is that ownership, I think the uncertainty in thinking about ownership projections is absolute. So in other words, what I'm saying is that, say I think that Charlie Morton is probably going to be if I'm confident he's going to be about 25 to 35% owned or something like that, right? There's roughly like maybe 5 points of error in either direction. That's probably still about how confident I am, even at these guys lower, right? So say someone like, I don't know, one of these guys down here, right? Am I confident that like some random guy like Nick Pivetta is going to be 5% owned? Well, no, I'm probably more confident that he's going to be like 2 to 10% owned or something like that. But that's a much more wider range in relative terms, and it makes it much harder to know exactly what to do based on your exposure, right? If he comes in at 2% owned and he's 6% optimal, well, then there's 3x leverage on rostering him, right? But if he's 8% owned, then it's inefficient to roster him more than the field, right? And it's difficult to project for these guys that are going to be expected to be lower owned anyway. So I like to focus a lot of my attention on the higher projected ownership guys, because even if there's uncertainty in their ownership projections, I don't know exactly how highly owned they're going to be. I have a more confident idea of at least saying I want to be over or under the field. So that it also makes me more confident in my stands. Like the way I ultimately end up doing this is I look for a few. I don't necessarily want to be super precisely leveraged against every single player in the field. I'm looking for the biggest, most egregious outliers, the players that I think are going to be most out of line, and then making my adjustments there. I think on hitters, it's also very easy too, right? Typically on these slates, I feel like the teams with the highest projected team totals get very highly owned pretty quickly. So if I'm thinking, again, I just updated ownership projections pretty quickly, but if I'm thinking it's going to be like teams like Boston, right? A team that I adjusted some ownership projections on. I think these are totally realistic ownership projections for a team like this, right? They're playing, whether they're actually, I don't know if they're playing in Camden or Fenway, but both great hitting parks. Probably against some terrible pitcher. Again, I haven't actually researched the slate too much here tonight, but they are full run over the rest of the teams in the field at the moment. I think they're likely to be very chalky, right? I absolutely could see them coming in at like 20%, 20%. This even for Hernandez is probably going to be more like 20%, right? It's very easy to see just how much of a stand there is worth taking on a team like Boston very quickly. And a team like this, where I'm thinking they're going to be twice as owned, or even maybe 3 times as owned as their expectation, I'm probably very likely to just full fade that team. And maybe even the full lineup, depending on how I'm thinking that's going to break out overall. So, yeah. I think it's also easier to do on the hitters, right? In my experience, pitching ownership is a little bit more efficient. There's not always the big stands to find with these guys on the pitching side. There can be. A flag to me is always a cheap pitcher that's going to be exceedingly high owned. So I know Marco Gonzalez went out and threw a freaking complete game yesterday, but he was 45% owned. The trends before the game started, both with our ownership projections and Vegas, indicated that he was going to be very highly owned. I essentially completely faded Gonzalez because in my research builds, I was seeing that he had a 15 to 20% chance of being optimal. And I knew he was going to be more owned than that. I knew he was probably going to be significantly more owned than that. So that was an opportunity on pitching, but I see it happen more egregiously and more often on the hitting stacks. There's kind of, this is one way of doing this with looking at the ownership projections, but you can also always do it with the team stack method. And I think this is a little bit maybe easier where you don't really end up in the weeds with ownership projections of handling it this way. And again, it's just a matter of comparing what the expectation is, how often we think a stack ends up being optimal to how often we think the stacks are going to be used. And you can see it kind of quickly. Like, yeah, Boston's the 5th best stack, right? But Vegas and the general public's not going to think that. They're going to think they're far and away the best stack. And you can kind of see the writing on the wall here of the leverage you might get by taking an underweight stance or a fading stance on Boston. And again, we could also say, oh, Atlanta's going to be, oh no, they're probably going to be pretty high low too. Let me see if there's a team like the Dodgers. Dodgers might be a good one. Where are the Dodgers? Why can't I see this today? Okay, yeah, so there's the Dodgers. So yeah, they're like, the field's going to think about them as like, what, the 10th best team or something like that, and we think they're the 2nd best team, right? Yeah, we could say, okay, I want to emphasize ownership to the Dodgers. But again, when they're down here in this middle area, I just don't really feel confident about knowing just what the field's going to do with them. Like, are they actually going to be, if they're 5% owned, right? I might want 40% of my lineups to have Dodgers in them. But if they're 10% owned, they're double, I maybe want a little bit less. And it's just hard to know, even with that little bit of uncertainty. what I want to do. But with the teams at the top, the teams that I think are going to be the chalkiest teams, it just gets a lot easier just because I can say right off the bat, I know I want to be underweight on the Red Sox. I don't want to be the field's overweighting their likelihood of being the optimal team. Brewers is a weird case because it's the weather game, but Rays, same deal, right? Actually, maybe not. Maybe Rays are right about in line. If they're the third best team and we've got them fourth, maybe that's close. Braves, another team, right? And as we start to get down here and we start to get into some of these next best teams, again, San Diego grades out about appropriately. We start to get into a range of uncertainty. So I'm already kind of seeing what my stands on the slate might look like. It might be a pretty heavy fade of Boston, right? And then I might go look at the pitching and see if there's anything in pitching that I think is a little off, right? Or anything like that. So let's see who the chalkiest pitchers are going to be. But yeah. So I don't know. I don't want to get too into the weeds with this particular slate, but again, if you're going to do this player by player and look at projected ownership, right? Because our projected ownership is determined using a method that is very similar to this. So again, without updating projected ownership, and that's why sometimes there can be some inefficiencies here. Because we will assume that the field is basically sharper than they are, to be honest. And the projected ownership numbers might come in a little low or a little bit too similar to what those players' chances of being optimal are. I would recommend, if you're going to do this on a player-by-player level, to make adjustments to the projected ownership first, based on what you think is more likely to actually take place in the slate, and then compare players' chances of being optimal against their projected ownership. Alternatively, take use of something like the team stacks to look at it on a team-by-team basis, which I think is a little bit more of a simpler approach. So this is for baseball specifically, but I do the same thing for something like golf. And on golf, like 90% of my process is dialing in ownership projections. That is pretty much all I'm interested in doing. I really want to get a very good idea of what the field is going to do, because I think that's the biggest edge we have. And then I do the same thing, right? Once I really feel like I'm confident in the ownership projections of where I want them to be, again, you can use Vegas odds for things like that. There's a lot of free golf content out there. I think it's pretty easy to just spend a little time on DFS Twitter or YouTube and get an idea of what the field is going to do, and then adjust ownership projections, and then do the same thing there. Compare their chances of being optimal in 1,500 simulations of the tournament versus what the ownership projection is going to be, and make your leverage stance. But the big flag for me is a highly owned player, or one of the highest owned players or stacks or something like that, being two times more owned than I think they should be. That's where I start thinking about a full fade type situation, because it is easier to feel confident about the highest owned teams being the highest owned teams, even if you don't know the exact number of the ownership that they're going to end up at. And it's easier to just see those leverage opportunities. So that's my approach overall. Devin, I see you had a follow-up question here, so I'm going to tackle this real quick. And I think this is a little bit more smart diversity kind of thing. So the question is, when using smart diversity at 10 and the builder chooses one sim at random, does it mean if a player scores 20 points in 10% of sims, that there is a 10% chance that that smart diversity chooses one of those sims at random? Or if it's truly random, how can you trust smart diversity of 10 when doing a research build to show you percent of time said stack or player shows up in optimals? Why not use a lower smart diversity 5 through 7? Yes. So if a player scores 20% in 10% of their sims, then yes, there is a 10% chance that the smart diversity at 10 randomly chooses a game simulation where that player scores 20 points. So yes, it is truly picking out a random game sim for every game on the slate every time it builds a single lineup. And when we have 1,500 of these, by no means is this this isn't even close to the mathematical number of actual different ways the slate could play out, but it's a lot. And I think it's a useful tool for getting a good idea of where the leverage opportunities are on the slate. The reason I don't want to use a lower smart diversity is because I don't want to look at anything that resembles an average. I don't want to double count game simulations, I guess, for lack of a better word, when I'm just trying to get an idea of how likely a certain player is to be optimal. Let me know if that makes sense, right? Because if we did this at smart diversity of 5 or something like that, it is going to overweight the chances that highly point per dollar players are likely to be optimal in their lineups, because the average game simulation indicates that they do outperform their projection, right? But I'm not so much looking for players that are very likely to succeed at the averages or in the average number of game simulations. This is basically showing me, like, when we look at this lineup, for example, this is basically saying that this lineup was essentially very nearly optimal, the best possible lineup you could have built in the game, the random set of 14 game simulations it picked out for these players' projections. So like Morton and Flaherty were the optimal pitchers. They were the best 2 you could roster. And this one, it was Morton and Luzardo. In this one, it was Alzolay and Flaherty, right? So I want single game simulations for this to be as accurate as possible for what I'm attempting to accomplish. But let me know if that that helps. So got a thumbs up from Devin, so it looks like we're all good there. I saw a follow-up question from Adam too, so I'm going to tackle these two because I think these follow-ups are helpful when I talk about them quickly after the question I answered. So Adam said, maybe something to consider, though, is how the average is impacted when you're building for single entry versus MME. Reason being, the degree I bump one guy, like a chalk pitcher in single entry, may be significant versus how much or how little it might bump in an MME where ownership doesn't condense. But in general, great to know, and great to know that the model is contingent upon the average and how the bumps impact. Yeah. I think I'm maybe a little bit confused here. I agree. You are right that ownership does definitely condense more on single entries. If you're building lineups for single entries, I think it's totally fine to adjust ownership projections through that lens, right? They don't need to be absolute ownership projections. They can be contest specific based on the contests we know we are playing. It should still have the impact. The average ownership projection at the position should still update accordingly, right? If in a single entry, Morton and, I don't know, Wheeler, it seems like those are kind of like, actually, I think, yeah, maybe it's like Morton and Wheeler are going to be like the guys, and maybe they're 40 and 40% owned or something like that, right? It's just going to raise that average more. So all the players under the higher average are going to be treated as fading the chalk, basically. And that would be true. That would be what you would want. Whereas you're going to get less leverage out of fading these guys in a contest like a big 150 max where their ownership projections are lower. So the ownership average is going to come down, which means like the impact of a player being under that average is lower. So it should all work in the way that you would want and expect, I think. But if I'm misunderstanding you here, definitely shout back at me. So, okay, cool. Another question here from Ross. This came in right at the start of the show, so we'll hit this real quick, and then we'll hop over to YouTube chat. And this question said, how can I save my lineups to look at later or the next day to compare which ones did better than others? Often when I go back to yesterday's builds, my original lineups I used aren't there anymore because maybe the player projections had changed and my original top lineups are now a different lineup. Yeah, so that can definitely happen, especially say you build your lineups, you get everything dialed in, all the lineup cards are out. Well, maybe they're not, but whatever. And you build and you enter your lineups 30 minutes before lock, and then like a very minor sim runs or something like that. The ones that run typically right up against lock can be like umpire changes, especially in the first game of the series. That has a very minor impact on the projections, but can change the lineups that show up in the build later. So what I recommend you do is, let's go ahead and just bring this back to 150 for the sake of example, is save your lineups. So the way you would do that is, let's make a couple adjustments here just so we actually have a set of lineups that we're like working with. Something like that. That's fine. If you click this save button, it's going to save. It's going to timestamp it up here, and this should be permanent. So you should be able to, even if you go back tomorrow and this build has updated, because obviously sims are going to run later throughout the day, I should still be able to go back in here and say, show me what the lineups I had in this build were at 12:39 p.m. today. And then you can judge them from here. You can do review mode, whatever you want. So that should work. Again, just click the save. I think I'm not positive that in the, I think this is intended to be automated more, if not in the visual update redesign that we're planning on pushing out here soon, in the near future after that. But I know this is a little bit of a weird manual process at the moment. It could be very easy for us to just kind of auto save here every few seconds or every time a change is made. So that's something we are thinking about. But for now, if you save, you should be able to go back. And then, of course, I can go and click different builds here. This might be because this is just such a big build. Or maybe the exposures are persistent when you click in between builds. But it should be updating here, and it changes based on your different settings going back and forth. So that should work, Ross. If you run into any problems with that, let me know. But that would be, I would recommend doing that. I think it's just a good idea in general to get in the habit of when you're making changes and tweaking things around every so often. Maybe when you've got a good stopping point or you're kind of more just like looking into things, hit save. Sometimes I'll have slates where I go, I'll make a bunch of changes and I realize at some point that I've taken things a little too far and I don't want to walk back all of my exposure settings by clicking this button, but I do want to make some minor changes or something like that, or I want to walk back the last couple. It can be nice to know that I can just go back and click a different lineup set and get back to what I had in there. So, but Ross said right on. Perfect. All right, guys, cool. Let's see. We're cruising 41 minutes in. We've got a few questions here in YouTube chat, so let's go ahead and get into this. All right, James said in a 150 max entry, the one on DK for $1, probably the mini max, right? There's up to around 49,000 entries. I'm sure not everyone maxed out 150. How would you approach that type of build? Yeah, so not everyone is going to max out that contest, right? But the sharpest players are. And I think that's an important note, especially as you increase in dollar amount. The people that are maxing out the contest are typically going to be the sharper players, right? They are players that have, this isn't like a fact, this isn't a law, but it is a general truth that the sharpest players have the greatest number of lineups in the contest, or are most likely to max it out, which is why, in general, I recommend, if you're going to play these kinds of contests, to only play the ones that you can afford to max out. So you are not outmatched on a pure quantity level by the sharpest players in the pool. Of course, that's not a requirement. I know there's a lot of players that play 20 to 50 lineups in 150 max entries and build profitable lineups and do well for themselves. I don't like that approach personally. I would say if you're going to max out the contest, you want to be matching up equally against the sharpest players in the pool. So I would say that much to start. But apart from that, 150 max, 49,000 entries. How would you approach that type of build? That's going to be a tough contest to win. And that's so close to the 50K range that I probably would start thinking about maybe even using the over 50K entrance here. Again, these are kind of large buckets, right? But from my mind, to win a contest like that, right, it's going to be hard. You're up against a lot of other entries. I'm okay taking on a little bit more risk and upping my ownership fade and smart diversity accordingly and using the default sliders here like this. But from there, I don't think there's a dramatic change necessarily in the overall approach. And this is something I've talked about a lot here when we get questions about single entry. How should I tackle this single entry contest? Or how should I tackle high stakes, right? Or how should I, in this case, tackle the mini max, right? I think our overall strategies of trying to find leverage via ownership, obviously making sure that we're going in with good stacks and things like that, all still stay the same. So I think in terms of how I would tackle this, I would probably, my actual working build that I use to build lineups would probably be using these settings where I'm taking a more aggressive stand on ownership fade and emphasizing upside. But from there, I would start my process the same way. I would do my chalk builds. Oh, I meant to say that earlier. I should have mentioned that. When we were talking about this question earlier from Devin, sorry to kind of interrupt and jump around here, but I really meant to say this earlier. So when we were talking about this question, right? If you are struggling, like I was kind of working with the general assumption that you have an idea of knowing where ownership is going to go. If you are struggling with that, I highly recommend running the chalk build. And what the chalk build is, and this is tedious, and I know it's tedious. It will be less tedious in the future when we have a reset all button. But the chalk build would be updating all of your team totals to match Vegas, and then running a build using cache settings and setting a manual 5 stacking rule because correlation is off, and then building 150, and then viewing that full pool for the full 1500. And then looking at the exposures there. And then with that, I think those can sometimes take the place or stand in as ownership projections very well. Highly recommend checking that out if you're struggling to kind of intuitively get an idea of where the chalk's going to go, or if my idea of saying, look at your exposures in your research build and then try to determine if you think players are going to be over or under owned on that. If you're like, what? How do I do that? Start here with a chalk build. And what this is doing is this is mimicking what people with traditional optimizers that show up with a random optimizer that uses average projections, setting a 5 stacking rule and just pressing go projections based on Vegas, right? It's going to give you a very good idea of what a lot of the field's going to do. So I wanted to mention that, right? That's a very good way. And if we ran that, then we would really actually probably get to better see like just where do we think the pitcher ownership is going to go and where do we think the ownership of certain players and hitters and stacks and things like that are going to go. So anyway, I totally meant to mention that earlier. Sorry, just popped into my head, but let's come back here. I don't think I have too much more to mention here on this question, but I would say, again, my process wouldn't dramatically change here in terms of what I was doing for this build, but I would just know that to win this contest, right, especially based on what we're seeing in the sliders, I would probably want to take pretty aggressive stance on the field, right? I would definitely be running my final build on a high smart diversity, but even with ownership fade at 4, after running my research build and my chalk build to get an idea of where the leverage is, I would take aggressive stance to bring down a contest of this size. And if I felt like players were going to be 1.5, 2 times over owned, I would be crossing them off. I would be fading very aggressively. And the video where I walked through my process of building 150 lineups with SaberSim. I'm going to pull this up here on the screen here on our YouTube channel real quick. This video here on our YouTube channel, on our YouTube channel, under strategy sessions, building 150 MLB DFS lineups with SaberSim. That was for a contest of this type, or at least included a contest of this type. So if you haven't seen this already and you want to see me walk through my process, this was for the July 31st slate of building, I think it was a Friday too, building my 150 lineups and seeing this all in action. Definitely recommend checking this video out or reviewing this here. But yeah, again, overall, with these kinds of questions, process doesn't change that much for me in different contest types, right? Single entry, 150 max, that kind of thing. I'm making adjustments to my sliders. I'm maybe being more aggressive in bigger contests, higher entry limits, top heavier payout structures. But the process that I'm using to get there, to determine where those leverage opportunities are, is different, right? Like we just did a research build and it looks like Boston is going to be overowned, I think, right now at the moment. But a lot of those other teams, we were kind of in agreement. SaberSim thought they were the best teams. Vegas thought they were the best teams. If I'm playing a big 150 max, that might not be enough leverage to just fade Boston. I might need to do something else. I don't know what it is at the moment. Maybe I'm running a chalk build and really digging into the pitching ownership projections and seeing if I find leverage on some of the highest owned pitchers and fading some of those guys. Maybe I'm looking to see if there's some middle of the road or lower projected or lower run total teams that the field is going to under own. And maybe I'm bumping up projections on those teams to get a little more of those in my build. But the process that I use to get there is the same. And I think that's important. I think that's a really important point, right? When we get these kinds of questions, there's different strategies for these contests. Of course, you don't need to be as leveraged against the field in smaller contests. You want maybe some bigger stacks, more commonly using stacks in your smaller contests and things like that. But your process for any given sport should probably stay relatively consistent for all of the different entries, all the different contest types you are playing. Your process of research, your process of understanding how you're going to attack the slate. And then you use what you know about the contests themselves, with the sliders being a guide to help you. I'm playing a single entry that is 500 people. How should I approach this differently? Right? Okay. I don't really need to worry so much about ownership fade at all. So I'm going to just mostly kind of stick to the best plays while still getting some upside into my lineups. I want to build really correlated lineups. Okay, I understand the slate. I know how I'm going to attack this, right? 150 max, right? Okay, I need some big stacks. I'm going to take a moderate stance on my ownership overall, and I'm going to look for some really high upside plays, right? But the process that you use to get there and know what you're actually going to do with that information is the same. Who's overowned? How much are they overowned? Who's underowned? How much are they underowned? So on. So I'll get off my soapbox on this particular question. Let me know if anyone has any other questions on that. I see James said, thanks, that's helpful. Yeah, perfect. Let's see. I see some just general NFL excitement here, which is awesome. I am also very excited. It's coming up on us fast. I know there's been some preseason games this week, so pretty exciting stuff there. I don't see any other questions. Oh, I do. All right, let's see. Got one from Tone930 here in Slack. Let's go ahead and hit this. All right. I've been reviewing previous slates and been running builds based off default SaberSim and leaving the contest-specific contest settings for the slider as is, with the exception being that I've always set smart diversity at 10 no matter what and building for 150 regardless of entry limit. What I'm noticing is that a significant amount of time, big-time lineups are being generated, but they are middle of the road or low ranking in terms of Saber score and projected points filters. It seems like exposures are key. How would you recommend if there are lineups in my pool that I like but are not ranked high? How can I make the optimizer give me these lineups out of the pool? That's tough. It's a hard question to answer, right? Because hindsight is 2020, and we know after the slate is run what the best lineups are, right? Saber Score is trying to quantify that beforehand, right? That's what Saber Score is basically intended to do. Don't look at projected score. Look at the upside and the correlation and the ownership fate of the lineup, and then determine what the best ones are. But sometimes they're not there, right? Sometimes they're not the highest Saber score lineups. I think it is a testament to your process in general if of all of the lineups you could be building, you are handing SaberSim a set of projections and build settings, whether using the defaults or making adjustments, that is leading to having top lineups in your final 1500, right? Because there are hundreds of thousands of viable lineups you can build on a slate. And in your 1500, even if you're only entering 150, you're getting those upside lineups. I would say it's probably more likely that it's really just a matter of time until the variance hits you the right way and you get the right lineups in your pool. Again, this is kind of one of those things where it's difficult to say, like, how do you edit exposures in the right way to get the right lineups out of your 1500? That's tough. But a few things that I think can actually be helpful and actionable here. I would say one is play more lineups, right? If you can. If you are playing 20, if it's possible, drop down in stakes and play 150. That doesn't even have to necessarily be 150 max. That means maybe instead of playing the $4 20 max, the four-seamer or whatever, maybe play the quarter jukebox and a lot of some of the bigger dime times, and maybe the solo shot, right? And get a way of playing 80 lineups instead of playing 20, right? Even if you're playing 150 maxes, if you are really trying to capture those lineups more often and get those lineups and smooth out your variance, smooth out the waiting period between the big payoffs, play more lineups, right? That could even look like instead of playing a 150 max, right? Maybe instead of playing the $1 mini max, you play the 50 cent mini max and you add in a bunch of single entries. And instead of playing 300, instead of playing 150, you're playing 300 lineups, right? That's going to be another way of smoothing out your variance. You just get more shots at it. You get more lineups out of your 1500 and put them in the pool, right? But otherwise, it's tough to say. I would say with your exposure management, I think it comes down to some of the same principles of the opportunities that are going to allow you to find the lineups that are at the top of your contest at the end of the night are by finding players that are going to be a little less owned or inefficiently owned for their outcome potential, right? It doesn't really matter. You're not trying to come up with the actual optimal lineup. You're trying to pull out the lineups in your pool that have the greatest chance of being the best lineups in the contest. And it's a very different thing even though it sounds kind of similar. So when you're thinking about every exposure editing change you make, I would ask yourself, is this moving me in a direction that is efficient? Are these lineups that I'm getting now, do they have a greater percent chance of, I don't even know the right way to explain this without just sounding like really circular and kind of like pedantic here, right? But it comes down a lot to the ownership potential of certain players and stacks versus their chances of being optimal. Like, make sure the changes you are moving you in that direction. But I think the broader point and the more effective and practical point here is, if, first of all, remember that landing those lineups in your 1500 is an achievement, right? Because there are hundreds of thousands of lineups that you can build on any slate, and you're narrowing down to a pool of 1500 and getting some very high upside lineups. And even though you're narrowing that down further to 150 and maybe sometimes not getting those lineups in, they're there. You're getting that close, right? That's good. That means you're likely, the variance will swing in your favor at some point if you're using sound bankroll management and contest selection. But if you want to smooth out that variance and make that happen faster, play more lineups, drop down in stakes, get more lineups. That's the most actionable advice I would give for that particular question. So, so Tone said, sounds good. So maybe something like optimal percent divided by projected ownership. That's going to be a very quick and dirty way of assessing leverage. That's not, that will, so yeah, no, that would probably just work. Yeah. That's like going to be a very cheap and quick way of calculating whether it's worth playing those players. So, okay. So a question came in from Kay Schwarzy. Hey man, another question on one-offs because I'm having a hard time getting them where I want them. For example, the SaberSim optimizer forced Anthony Alfred yesterday and would not allow me to limit him without ruining my stack exposures. Interesting. That's a hard question to answer. I assume he was probably in your player pool because you were okay using him as a stack, but didn't want him as a one-off. There is going to be a level of control here that at some point is, to be completely honest, going to be difficult to manifest in your builds, because we don't have a only use in stacks type rule for players for a reason, really. And the reason is that kind of rule is a bit of a handcuff that is given to traditional optimizers that don't really deal with the problem of correlation and upside well. I would say beyond the strategy we talked about the other day, which is limiting your player pool. The problem here is that, so the other day I walked through where you could set a stacking rule and only include the teams that you wanted to stack. And then for the teams that weren't in this list, go through and remove the players besides the ones that you wanted to use as one-offs. So maybe it's like the Cubs are a one-off team, and maybe we only want one-off, right? But of course, if we're stacking Milwaukee, it's entirely possible that you could get a Lorenzo Cain one-off in one lineup because he's in your pool, and maybe you don't want that. It's gonna be hard to limit that, to be completely honest, at the moment. So in a future update, what we're trying to do here, let me pull up my test build from the beginning of the day here, is to give you more action and more opportunities for action here around your, oh, hold on, I still have a filter set. Around your filters. So like right now, we could go and say, so we could say, show me, we can't do this right now. Hold on, getting ahead of myself. Let me let the app catch up. I'm going to reset exposure settings too. Get everything back to normal. Okay. So you can't do this right now, but this is coming. we could go ahead and say in the future, show me lineups with Freddie Freeman. Okay, so he's used in 100% of stacks, right? But say he wasn't. Say this was 90%, and that would indicate that there are 2 Freddie Freeman one-off lineups, and say we knew we didn't want to do that. Our goal here is to implement a feature tool that would say, show me includes Freddie Freeman, is not an Atlanta stack, and then from there, one button click, remove those lineups from your pool, right? To do things like this. At the moment, though, I don't really have a great way of giving you anything more of how to do this more beyond what I've given you already. I would say, from my perspective, and again, like different strokes here, but I would say if you're already going through the steps of setting the exact rules of the teams you want to stack, and then from there, limiting the player pool on the teams you're not stacking to only include the exact players you want to use as one-offs, if you get a player that you're already using in some stack lineups as a one-off, the builder in some ways is telling you that that player has the right mix of upside and ownership to fit into the lineup where they do. And I realize that's not super satisfying. And it's like, well, I don't want this. And I frankly just don't have any more ways to tell you beyond right now with the current set of tools of how you can limit that. It is coming. I know we have had a lot of users say they want more control over things like that, especially for stuff like football, right? Don't give me Justin Jefferson and Thielen together unless I have Kirk Cousins. That's an example, like that kind of thing we hear often. And that's also not a problem that is very easily solved at the moment. But that kind of thing is coming. K. Schwarzy said, no worries, man. A lot of times the players SaberSim wants, a lot of generally do quite well. Just so happens Anthony Alfred was not hot yesterday. Yeah. And again, I know the worst question I get here is one that I feel like I can't really give you a way to get what you want out of the tool. But we have had that kind of question come up a lot, and we are hoping to get more robust filtering options here. I don't know if those are going to ship with, there are more robust filtering options shipping with the redesign, but the level of being able to remove or add lineups that fit your certain filters on the fly might come in the very next update after that. But it's on our radar. We've gotten a lot of questions about it and a lot of feedback. So I know that's something that would be helpful, but thanks for asking the question anyway. And I apologize that for now, I don't have a more satisfying answer there. But one more question from Devin here, or maybe not one more, but another question. General DFS question. I've heard pros like Osimo say they need to do stuff in Excel prior to lock or making lineups. Any idea what they're talking about? I have no idea. I don't know what kind of Excel wizardry anyone's talking about. Another goal of what we were really kind of trying to accomplish here with SaberSim is to remove the need to do things like that. That's not to say you can't, right? We've had some users, I've had users send me some pretty sweet looking spreadsheets based on different tools we've talked about that combine chalk builds and research builds all into one tool that lets them see everything and organize things out into a spreadsheet to consolidate their research process. I know a few of you guys have some cool spreadsheets like that. That's awesome. I think that's great. Part of the reason the way we built SaberSim is to avoid having to feeling like you have to do that, right? That would be kind of another tool of trying to get a traditional optimizer built to optimize around average projection to work better, right? I can't speak to exactly what those guys are doing, but it's not something you need to feel like you're missing out on or have to be doing to use SaberSim, right? The whole point of simulating games play-by-play and getting an idea of real ranges of outcomes and quantifying correlations and things like that all in the app is so that you can not worry about having to finagle with spreadsheets, unless you want to, of course, unless it helps your research process, but that you can build effective lineups all in the tool, all with the optimizer. So I also, it could be, it wouldn't surprise me if Osmo is just trolling too. He's kind of a little bit of a goofball on Twitter. I wouldn't be surprised if some random guy asked him a message on Twitter of how his process works, and he said, it all comes down to doing stuff in Excel. I would find that hilarious, but I could be wrong there too. So Let's see. Dean said anything on NFL Showdown. Yeah. So we don't have preseason sims. So we have like some rough projections up for week 1 that are up mostly just to mess around with, have a little bit of fun with. As we get closer though, especially approaching that final week before opening night, happy to talk a lot about NFL Showdown. I think it's still a little bit too early to like really break into like strategy or looking at anything there for now. But as we get closer, we obviously will support all the NFL Showdowns. I think we will, as football season approaches, we will probably start getting, first of all, a lot more people in this stream, which will be really exciting, but also a lot more football questions. So we'll get there soon. Dean said, I've been enjoying these new lives, but nothing yet on NFL preseason. Yeah. So, okay. To be completely honest, like I'm not playing very much NFL preseason because I don't really play a lot of the sports that we don't do projections for. And at the moment, we're in a full all-out focus here to be ready for the regular season. So I know there are some folks playing NFL preseason. I would definitely recommend hopping into the NFL channel in Slack. There's some interesting conversation there going on every day. I know some folks are having some success. It's not something that I've been playing a lot of because we don't run game sims. We don't do projections for them. So I know maybe not a very satisfying answer there. I find the preseason sports and like NBA Summer League and things like that to just be very hard. And I think there's an edge there, but it's just not in my contest mix. So I don't want to give out advice here or anything like that on a contest that I'm not myself playing. But I will be playing NFL like crazy when we get to the regular season. I'm very excited for it. We will shift very much to the NFL content as that gets a little bit closer and as questions kind of dictate here. But I think this preseason stuff ends up being, at least from what I kind of understand, a lot of staying very in tune to the news and trying to get an idea of just who's going to get the snaps. So that's true for NBA Summer League too. I think it comes down to just like staying very in touch with the beat writers, updating very quickly when the starting lineups come out, and just trying to find your edge that way. But football's coming. I know for some people it's already here with the preseason, but for me, it will really be kicking off here in a couple weeks. So, all right, guys, another rockin' show here today, hour and 7 minutes or so. Thank you for everybody that asked questions all week. Really, we've had a great week of office hours. It's been a lot of fun. We've had some awesome conversations in here. I hope this is continuing to help you guys. It's helping me just sitting here coming on and talking about DFS for an hour every day. But I hope it's helping you guys out too. I hope you're getting something out of this. If you are, well, whether you are or aren't, I'm always looking for feedback. So if you have thoughts on how this show could be better or how it could better serve you or people in general, feel free to share that. You can share that directly with me. If you want to do so privately in a DM, that's fine on Slack. You can email us, support@sabersim.com. However you want to go about that. But again, this show is for you guys, and this is supposed to be as helpful as possible. So let me know if there's anything we can do to continue to make this better and better every week, right? So enjoy the big slate tonight. Friday is, I think, one of the best days for MLB DFS. Have some fun with it. We will be back here again next week, Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions over the weekend, playing any of the slates this weekend, whatever, feel free to get them in the queue, pop them into the Slack channel, or email us, support@sabersim.com. In the meantime, I will see you guys next week. Have a great weekend. And until then, take care.